Today we're going to do a little pattern hack on the Wholecloth Project Bag. As the pattern is written, there is no lining, but all of the interior seams are fully finished. The seams around the opening is just a double fold hem, and the interior seams are flat felled. So even though there's no lining, the interior is really neat and tidy, and I think it's a really beautiful and simple way to make this type of bag. But today we're going to change it up a little bit and make a fully lined version of the Wholecloth Project Bag. The one advantage to the lining is that it also makes the bag fully reversible. It's the same on the inside as the outside. And this is actually a little bit of a simpler way to sew a bag of this style. So if you're new to sewing, you might actually want to start here. For the bag I'm making today, I'm going to use this fine wale corduroy for the exterior of the bag. And I just have this left over from a pair of pants that I made last year. And this super lightweight cotton print for the lining. This corduroy is a little bit heavier than I would normally recommend to make a project bag, but I like the way the added sturdiness of the fabric adds more structure to the bag. As you can see, having the thicker fabric makes it more likely to stand up, and I'm probably going to use this bag as a clutch purse, and I feel like the extra structure to the bag will help it hold its shape when I've got heavier things in it, like my wallet or my keys. The lining is a great place to kind of dress the bag up a little bit. I love that you get the little pop of color even when the bag is closed. I'm going to make a size medium for the video today. I think it's the right size for the clutch that I want. And then I can use this size small that I made last week during the sew along as a little pouch to keep small things separate inside the bag. We're going to modify the Wholecloth Project Bag, but you'll still need a copy of the pattern to follow along. And if you're new to the project bag, you can find a complete video tutorial and links to the pattern in the notes below the video. Now, let's get started. I'm going to start by cutting out my exterior fabric. So here I have fine wale corduroy that I have left over from a pair of pants that I made. And here is my pattern piece. And for this project, I'm gonna align the green with the direction of the corduroy stripe. So technically it's perpendicular to the grain of the fabric. And then I'm just gonna pin it down and cut it out like I normally would for a project bag. Going to make the lining with this block print fabric, and here I have it right side facing, and here's my pattern piece, but this time I'm going to cut the pattern piece upside down. Whenever the bag is finished, the lining is tucked inside the main part of the bag, and technically it's wrong side out. So for the front seams to be aligned, I'm going to make a mirror image of the exterior with the interior lining. I'm going to go ahead and pin this and cut it as if I were making it the normal way. The only difference is that I have turned the pattern piece upside down. Here are the pieces cut out, and I've marked the notches with red pins so you can see how mirroring the lining piece shifted the notches. Starting with the main fabric, we're basically going to do steps 1 and 2 from the standard sewing pattern, where we fold over the short sides to match up the notches and then pin where we have 2 layers of fabric. We're not doing step 3, which is to iron a crease in the short side. And since we're not doing step 3, I'm going to go ahead and position both sides before I sew. Next, we're going to sew from the fold to the end of this piece of the fabric. When we're making the standard pattern, usually we stop at the notch, but we don't need to do that for the lined version of this pattern. I'm going to repeat that step with the lining. I'm going to make sure I have my right side up on the fabric, and I'm going to fold based on the mirrored notches. Now that we have the basic shape of each bag, you can really see how we've mirrored the pattern by turning over the pattern piece, where the main seam slopes in one direction on the lining and in the other direction on the main fabric. Now I'm going to press each seam up toward the bag opening. Now we can skip ahead to step 13 in the pattern instructions. We're going to define the bottom of the bag. So we're going to use this side seam that we just sewed to find a 90-degree corner when we make the bag upright. So when the opening is facing up, we want to squish down the corners so that we get a 90-degree angle on the bottom corners of the bag. And because we pressed the seam toward the opening, we want the seam to roll toward the top of the bag here. And I'm going to press it and pin it so the seam allowance is on top. I'll use the chart in the pattern instructions to measure in from the corner along each edge of the bag, then connect those two marks to make a line to sew across the corner to give the bag a little bit of a bottom. And I'm going to repeat that on the other side. Now I'm going to repeat that on the lining. Now I'm going to sew across all four corners. Here's what the bottom of the bag looks like now that we've sewn closed those corners. It just gives it a little bit of dimension. And I've done the same thing to the lining. And now I'm going to turn the lining right side out. With the lining right side out and the bag wrong side out, I'm going to tuck the lining down into the bag and line it all up. You can see that I have the right side of the main fabric up against the right side of the lining fabric. And now I'm going to pin around the perimeter of the opening, matching up the points at the top and this V at the bottom. You can see that I've matched up the edges of the lining fabric with the edges of the main fabric the whole way around the opening, and I secured it with pins. I am going to leave a 3 or 4 inch opening along one long side so that I have a place to turn the bag right side out through. So using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, I'm going to start at the lower end of that opening. I'm going to be sure to pivot at the bottom of the V on each side of the bag and at the top corner on each side of the bag, and then I'm going to stop just before that opening, and I want to be sure to back stitch at the beginning and the end. Now that I've sewn around the outside of the bag, there are a couple little finishing things that I'm going to do. First, I'm going to clip this seam allowance right here at this bottom point, and we're going to clip through the seam allowance as close as we can get to the point, but we don't want to cut through the point of the stitching. And at the two upper points, we're going to grade those corners, so we're cutting off the seam allowance just above the corner of the stitching. I would say a 1/16, maybe a little more, away from this top tip of the stitching. And for both of these, it just allows the corners to lay flat when we turn the bag right side out. Because I'm using a pretty bulky fabric with this corduroy, I'm also going to grade the seam allowance of just the exterior fabric of the bag. So I'm just going to cut about half of the seam allowance off the whole way around. Because the lining fabric is a really lightweight cotton, I'm not going to worry about grading it. And I was careful here where we left the opening to be sure that I left at least 1/4 of an inch. So when we turn the bag right side out, we have a nice edge to finish. Now we're going to turn the bag right side out, and I'm just going to use this opening that we left to push the bag through. Here the bag is mostly right side out and the lining is just kind of hanging out here. I'm going to tuck the lining down inside the bag. And I just use a knitting needle to gently nudge the corners and these bottom ends into shape. I'm going to use the iron to set this edge. And as I iron, I'm just going to roll the lining fabric a little bit further toward the inside so that I can't see it on the outside edge. I put a few pins around the bag opening, and I did that just to keep the lining in place, because next I'm going to top stitch around this open edge the whole way around the opening of the bag, and I'm going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch from this edge. You just want to be sure you're close enough to the edge to catch both pieces of fabric where we left the opening to turn the bag. And there's the finished lined Wholecloth project bag.